Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the AAS YouTube channel. And this one is going to go down in the Author Series playlist. And I am super happy to have Dan Werthimer here with us today. Hey, Dan.
Hi. Hi, Frank.
Where are you dialing in from?
I'm in Berkeley. I'm at home. COVID times.
Yeah. We're all Zoomiversing here. Hey, I should let Chris Lintott know. Maybe that's a good name to know. Cool. So we are going to cover a recent paper that Dan was a co-author on, and this will be on a brand new 500-meter spherical telescope in China known as FAST. But we're going to generalize this a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about SETI and what SETI is and where the future directions may lie. And of course, we'll get into the APJ paper as well. So let's go ahead and give a start. So I'm going to do a screen share, and I'll let Dan take it away for a little bit, and I'll play along as we go. All right. So, oops. Okay, that was not good. Yeah, hold on. Okay, take it away. Sorry.
Great. Thanks, Frank. So let me introduce myself a little bit. I'm Dan Werthimer. I'm at UC Berkeley. I'm an astronomer here, and I run a group that does a lot of SETI research and instrumentation research, radio astronomy stuff. I'm not particularly good at astrophysics, but I'm good at building instruments that might answer astrophysics questions. I almost became filthy rich.
Well, that's good. Do tell.
Well, when I was a kid, I was in this club called the Homebrew Computer Club, and in that club were like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and we were all building our own little home computers. My computers were as good as theirs, or maybe even better. But they thought maybe we should sell those computers, and I thought, oh, maybe I could use these computers to do astronomy and SETI. So they got rich. Everybody in that club got filthy rich except for me, but I'm having a good time.
That's a great one. I didn't know you were part of that. That's awesome.
My research group is probably best known for the SETI at Home project in volunteer computing. And we generalized that SETI at Home project so you can participate in lots of different scientific projects. And one of the new ones is you can work on COVID-19 drugs, therapeutic drugs. But you can also, search for gravitational waves and planets and look for all cancer drugs and HIV drugs. And there's all kinds of projects that you can pick from, not just SETI. But
yeah,
today
we did a video yesterday. In fact, it just came out this morning with Chris Impey, and the topic was citizen science in your online class. And we covered things like SETI at Home and BOINC, and I'll put a link to that in the description below.
Oh, great. Yeah, we also do just citizen science projects. We did the Stardust at Home with our colleagues at Space Science Labs in Berkeley. Yep. So today I wanted to really concentrate on SETI, and we can talk about this new APJ paper on the FAST telescope. And then I think, Frank, you and I were talking that we could maybe talk a little bit more general about where we're going. Yep. And what other people are working on in SETI and what kind of the long-term future is of SETI.
That sounds great.
So this APJ paper is really it's not a big results paper. It's not the culmination of years of observing campaigns and a big data analysis paper. And here's our best candidates, and here's our minima, here's our, we can rule out these civilizations. This is kind of a down payment on that kind of paper. We're just getting started. We're at the beginning stages of a big observing campaign. And so the paper is called The First SETI Observations with China's 500-meter telescope, the FAST telescope. And this is a picture of the FAST telescope. It's this beautiful thing in southern China, 500 meters across. It's the largest radio telescope on the planet. If you have good eyes, you can kind of see the receiver in the middle there that's suspended on these cables way up above the dish. There are different kinds of receivers that you can put there for different wavelength bands. And we in SETI are mostly going to use this 19 pixel receiver. We call it a multi-beam receiver. And that allows us to cover the sky more rapidly. Most radio astronomy receivers are 1 pixel at a time. We're a little jealous of you optical and infrared astronomers that have millions and billions.
Yeah, I was going to say 19 pixels.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you know, our pixels are big on these single dish telescopes. Each pixel covers about 3 arc minutes across.
Okay.
So we can do a big sky survey in a few years. And there's a big survey that we're going to do on this telescope, which is called the Craft Survey. It'll take a few years, thousands of hours of telescope time. And we're going to be doing that with a lot of, we're not just using the telescope to do SETI. We'll be using it at the same time. Our colleagues will be doing FRB searches and pulsar searches and mapping hydrogen in the galaxy and extragalactic hydrogen cosmology and doing a whole bunch of, we do a bunch of surveys together.
Cool.
But we'll be just running continuously on this telescope for many years. We call that piggyback SETI. So we don't really know where to point the telescope. We don't know where ET is going to be lurking or even if they're out there at all. So we just kind of go along for a ride, whatever astronomers are doing with this telescope. This is what we've been doing at Arecibo for the last 30 years.
Yep.
We used to call it parasitic SETI, but that has a kind of bad connotation. Then we called it commensal SETI, 2 creatures eating out of the same dish.
There you go.
And some people call it piggyback. Anyway, we just run all the time. And we're just starting to do that with this FAST telescope. The FAST telescope was commissioned, just finished the commissioning phase in January, just a few months ago. So we're just beginning to do science with this telescope and starting this big survey, but we'll run all the time. And we'll always be collecting data independent of where the astronomers are pointing. But astronomers tend to point to interesting things and we don't know where to look anyway. So this telescope is made out of thousands of little dishes. You can see those triangular structures there. Mm-hmm. And the way that it points is you move that receiver around. You can kind of see it's on cables and you can pull on the cables. Yep. And then you can move the receiver to different places. So you can get to about half of the sky, I think from about -14 to +66 degrees in declination.
Okay.
And you might think, well, that's a problem because a spherical dish only has a single focus on the axis. But this dish can be distorted. Underneath each one of those panels, those thousands of panels, there are thousands of actuators. Yeah. And so you can make this thing into a parabola no matter where you're pointing. You can always keep it a parabolic dish and keep a focus at a point focus where the receiver is.
Very nice.
The receiver can bounce around in the wind, and there's all kinds of actuators to kind of keep it dynamically at the center. It's a very cool piece of technology. It's very impressive. So the next slide, Frank, shows these 5 different instruments that we're going to be, our group built the FRB instrument and the SETI instrument working with our colleagues in China. Then there are other instruments that run simultaneously. There's a thing that looks for pulsars. There's a galactic hydrogen spectrometer that makes a map of the galaxy while we're doing the survey. There's an extragalactic hydrogen spectrometer that goes to high redshifts to map galaxies and measure redshifts and hydrogen profiles. And there's a couple of SETI instruments. So we do these 5 instruments running simultaneously on this telescope while we're surveying the sky. So let me I want to talk a little bit about the details of this paper. Maybe we can come back to these slides, Frank. Okay. So this is a collaboration of not just my group at Berkeley, but a lot of people in China, mainly at a thing called NAOC, the National Astronomical Observatory of China. Yep. And that's part of the Academy of Sciences, the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And then there's also a large group at Beijing Normal University. And the lead author is a PhD student at BNU. And he was worked in my group for a year. And we analyzed the very first data, SETI data from this telescope. So I'm taking the credit for a lot of people there that you can see on the
spokesperson.
Yeah, I'm a spokesperson. Thank you. So maybe we can just talk a little bit about what we're planning. What we're doing in this paper is really just kind of talking about our plans, and we've made a little bit of observations to kind of demonstrate that the instrument is working and the pipeline is working. We're using a pipeline that normally we use on the SETI Home project called the Nebula Pipeline. This is a little figure of how it works. The top part, the top box is what happens in real time at the telescope using kind of hardware and computing right at the telescope. And then that part generates FITS files, which then you do offline analysis, and that's the bottom box. And offline, we analyze these FITS files doing the interference rejection. So there's a big problem in SETI, which we'll get into in a little bit, that you're looking for radio signals from ET, but what you find are radio signals from Earthlings. And there are satellites and television stations and radio and radar and people with cell phones. You're not supposed to have a cell phone or a camera at the telescope, but things get into these receivers that are not from the sky, or satellites are from the sky, but they're not the things we're looking for. So a big part of data analysis is what we call RFI rejection, radio frequency interference rejection. And it's getting worse and worse on this planet, and we may eventually have to move to the backside of the moon, put a telescope on the backside of the moon, and that'll shield, of course, the radio pollution won't get to that telescope, but that'll be incredibly expensive to have a big telescope on the back. So this may be a kind of unique window in our history where we can kind of do SETI before all the bands are polluted and filled up by all our transmitters and communication.
Yep.
Then the next step after RFI rejection is this candidate selection. We'll get into that, about the different ways that we find candidates and the different ways we remove the RFI. The next slide shows what the kind of is a blow up of what's going on at the telescope. So we have this 19 beam receiver at the focus of the telescope. That's not shown on this diagram. But then the 19 beam, each pixel, each one of those 19 pixels generates two signals, two polarizations. So we have 38 signals, and they're fed into those triangles, the black triangles that are analog to digital converters. So the way that we do spectral analysis is not the way that you do it if you're an optical or infrared astronomer with a diffraction grating or a prism. We do spectral analysis by digitizing the voltage as a function of time coming from these receivers, and then doing a big Fourier transform in software. Typically, we do it in software, and we need a lot of computing capability to do that. We are analyzing a 500 megahertz bandwidth from these 38 signals, so there's a lot of data. There's a gigabyte per second coming from 38 of these ADCs, analog digital converters. 38 gigabytes per second. And we feed that into a big bank of computers that you see on the right that has a bunch of these GPUs, graphic processing units. And they can do Fourier transforms pretty quickly. And so we're forming these 128 million point spectra. So we get 4 hertz resolution across 500 megahertz of the RF spectrum. And then what the computers do after that, after they compute the spectrum, is they record interesting events. So we don't record all 128 million spectral channels on 38 spectra. That's a lot of data, and we can't save it all on disk. It would be petabytes per day.
Yeah.
So we instead what we do is we just record information about the interesting signals. If there's a narrowband signal that's sticking up above the noise in our spectra, then we say, okay, we found a narrowband signal. This is the power, this is the right ascension, the declination, the time. record a little bit of the baseline around. So what you end up with is kind of a list of what we call the hits, the interesting events. We do record kind of the spectral, but it's a degraded resolution. So you don't keep the 4 Hertz resolution spectra. It's just too much data to keep.
Right. Decimated.
Yeah. Thank you. So decimated. Yeah. So we are working on a real-time system that kind of decides what's interesting, and then we can record the raw data on interesting bits, so we can go back to it and kind of look at it in more exquisite detail. But that's not what we're doing right now.
Okay.
So let me give you an example of the kind of data that comes out of this thing. So that's what this figure 3 is showing you. This is a little blow up of, this is not the whole band that we're analyzing. So on the x-axis there is frequency, not the whole band, but a few megahertz out of the 500 megahertz band. And on the y-axis is seconds, time. And it looks like we're looking at about a half hour of data here.
Yeah.
And a few megahertz wide. And on the right is just a little a picture of where the telescope has been, and you can just see it's moving in right ascension during this time. That's probably because we're not tracking an object. This is called a drift scan, so that we're just letting the Earth turn and the sky go by, and that's why the RA is steadily increasing with time over this half hour or so. And we call this a waterfall plot, this time versus frequency plot. And what you see on this waterfall plot are a bunch of black dots. And what each dot represents there is a signal that we found in our spectrum that was above the noise at some threshold, a little peak in the spectral data. And we call that a hit. And then we plotted all the hits over those 30 seconds in this frequency band. And what you'll see there is that there's some interference. Those 3 vertical lines are narrow band signals that are on pretty much continuously. We know this is not ET because the Earth is rotating and it's on all the time. It's not what we'd expect from ET. Is just when the telescope goes over a source, you'd expect to find the signal while you're going over the source, and then it should go away. So it should only be on for a short time. It should be consistent with the point source and kind of follow the point spread function that you'd expect, this sort of Gaussian beam. It should get stronger and then weaker. So these things that are on all the time, these 3 narrowband signals, are obviously RFI, and we can reject them, and we'll get into that later. One of our RFI rejection algorithm called zone RFI, where we just reject things that are on all the time. So those bands, we can't, if ET was in one of those 3 bands, we would not find ET because we just rule out those zones.
You're right.
There's some other stuff going on in the middle there. On that vertical line, there's some spread spectrum stuff that's associated with that signal, some modulation or something like that. We have to figure out ways to get rid of that as well.
Okay.
So let's see what else. So this is an example of the data. This is the raw data before it goes into our RFI rejection. This is another kind of signal that we have to reject. These are kind of drifting signals that are not it's staying at a constant frequency, some kind of crappy oscillator that's jumping around. And so we have down at the bottom of this figure, you can see that we've got this kind of RFI rejection algorithm that looks for these drifting signals. And if we see an excess number of detections in one of those triangles, we say, oh, this is not good. If it covers many beams on the sky, many pixels, then it's not consistent with the point source, and it has an excess density. So that's the drifting RFI rejection algorithm. So we have a bunch of these algorithms that reject these kind of signals before we can look for candidate signals.
Okay, cool.
This is, that little figure there, figure 6, is what we've learned is that you don't want to do these algorithms in series. Like you don't want to do like the zone RFI and then the drifting RFI. What we found is if you do them one at a time, the next algorithm down doesn't work as well as the one before it, because if you remove some of the data, then the second algorithm can't get at all the data. So we actually kind of do these in parallel. So each of these algorithms kind of looks at the raw data and figures out what it's going to reject, and then we add up all the rejections at the end. And this next little figure that's you're kind of shown halfway is a new kind of thing that we're trying out. This is a machine learning algorithm called KNN. It's a cluster analysis algorithm, and we're looking at the distance between these dots of these waterfall displays and looking for clusters. And you can see that there are events that are clustered together, and we kind of draw a threshold where if they're clustered heavily and they cover multiple beams in the sky, we say that's interference. If they're not clustered, we say that might be ET. We don't push the threshold out too much because then we might be throwing away clusters that are from ET. And we inject birdies into the data, fake signals, to make sure we're not throwing away too much of our band.
Right.
To kind of figure out where to draw that blue dotted line.
Uh-huh.
So let's see what else. What's the next thing? Oh, this is another thing that shows how many birdies we've lost. And this is kind of where should we draw that blue dotted line? And we find that we can still recover about 95% of the signals if we draw that dotted line there. We can still reject a good chunk of the RFI, and we haven't lost much of the band. We lose about 5% of the test signals that we inject to make sure we're not losing too much probability of losing ET.
What's a birdie?
Oh, a birdie is just a fake signal that we inject into the data to make sure our data analysis algorithms are working. It's a way to measure the sensitivity. You can inject weak signals and strong signals and different types of signals and see how many of them we recover and see how many of them are lost. It's just a way to test your data analysis system and your instrument. This is an example of kind of this new machine learning clustering algorithm before and after. It's removing some of the clusters, but not all of them. But some of the other algorithms remove what's left of this RFI. I'm not going to get too much into machine learning here. We're just learning how to do that in SETI. I'm optimistic about ML in the long run. I think one of the things I'm really excited about in ML is this new thing called anomaly detection, where you can look for just weird things that you haven't seen before. And I think SETI signals might fall into that class. Instead of being one of the different things that we look for, what if it's not one of those kind of things that we think ET is going to be doing? A lot of discoveries in astronomy are serendipitous discoveries when you find stuff that you didn't intend to find. And I think anomaly detection might be a good thing to do in SETI, because it may not, the signals that we're looking for now, ET might not be sending that kind of signal type. So
right.
We're trying to get into this anomaly detection and look for signals that we've never seen before. But we're just learning how to do that now.
Cool.
So let's see what else. This is more examples of RFI rejection. And you can see kind of, these are broadband signals. These are signals that are not kind of constant at frequency. These are things that at a particular time are covering many frequencies, these horizontal lines.
Right.
We call that broadband interference. And you can see we're in the after picture, the one on the bottom, we've rejected those pretty well with our broadband RFI rejection algorithm. Anyway, you can kind of tell we spent a lot of time on RFI rejection. This is a big problem. And this is a little plot of the 19 beams on the sky and kind of coarse resolution spectra. So this is kind of our sky coverage for an instantaneous sky coverage. Anyway, I think maybe I want to maybe talk a little bit about the candidate selection. So after we reject the RFI, we look for these candidates. And here's an example of things that we look for. These are things that are not on continuously, things that are kind of consistent with a point source. These are not ET, by the way. These are these birdies that we inject to see if our system is working. But it's the kind of thing that we look for.
Okay.
And that table is kind of showing you that we recover most of the birdies. So we think the thing is working if we can detect most of the fake ETs that we've injected.
Fake ETs, I love it. Okay.
So this is kind of RFI rejection stuff. I think we can kind of skip over this stuff. I think you got a good feel for all this stuff. You can tell the RFI is a lot of work. This is these are examples of candidates that got through that really are part of RFI. It was, and so there's our computer algorithms are not perfect. You know, we find things that the computer says, hey, I found an interesting candidate. And then when the humans look, they say, hey, really, that's not an interesting candidate. That's RFI. But our goal is not to make the computer algorithms perfect. Our goal is to make it so that the number of candidates come out is manageable by a human, and you do visual inspection. So always at the end of this pipeline, there are humans that look at the data and assess whether we found good candidates or whether it's not a good candidate. It's RFI that leaked through the RFI rejection algorithms. So they're humans in the loop at the end, but they can't do all the data. They can do look at the 1,000 best candidates and rank them. The computer does a ranking, but then the humans do the final ranking and decide what we want to look at again and do follow-up observations. Okay, maybe we can, I think we're kind of coming toward the end of the paper. Let's see if there's any other figures we should talk about. More groups of interesting candidates. These are not RFI candidates. Don't get your hopes up though. This is not ET. This is a very, we've analyzed a few hours of data. We're just getting started. And really, we won't have a big announcement until we've looked at years of data, and the big things are when you go back and you find it again. Right. At Arecibo, we've covered the sky many times, and the most interesting things are things that we've seen multiple times on the sky. But if you see it just once, it's not very interesting. There's a lot of RFI that gets through. So just because we've seen things that look interesting, don't get your hopes up. Don't hold your breath on this stuff.
You want to give me a quick little comparison between the advantages and disadvantages of Arecibo versus FAST?
Well, Arecibo, we've been running, 20 years, SETI at home. So we have a lot of data there, and we've covered the sky multiple times. FAST, we're just getting started. But I think we can do a very similar thing with FAST, and we're hoping to run a SETI at home project there as well as this Serendip instrument that we're talking about in this paper. And one of the nice things about FAST is they're going to be doing the systematic raster scan of the sky, this big sky survey. That's ramping down at Arecibo. That's already been done. FAST has more sensitivity. It's a bigger telescope. It's got a good receiver, covers a little bit wider bandwidth. So it's an improvement over Arecibo. But we're not shutting down at Arecibo. We're going to keep working. At Arecibo, we might switch over to a different band because we've done this band pretty well now, and it's time to move on to different frequencies and look for new signal types. Maybe, Frank, if there's a little more time, if you want, we could kind of move away from this paper and talk a little bit more about general stuff.
Yeah, let's take a step back and maybe walk through some history, and in particular, where is SETI going? What's the future of SETI? And what are we looking for, and all of that. So let me get the other slide set up. There we go.
Yeah, so on the next slide, Frank, this is kind of the history of SETI. So before radio was invented, there were lots of really clever ideas about how to look for ET. So Gauss said, make big geometric objects, a right triangle made out of pine trees, maybe 3, 4, 5 miles on each side, big squares of wheat, dirt, water, and ET would look down with their big telescopes and see that we knew about the Pythagorean theorem. And the next slide shows another idea from a couple hundred years ago. Von Littron said, dig a circular ditch 20 miles across and fill it with kerosene and use that match, not to scale, to make this bright circle of light, a bright ring of fire. And again, ET would look down with their 30-meter telescope, or maybe they'd use their sun as a gravitational lens, which would give very high resolution. They could read license plates. Then they would see this kind of object, or the Martians could see it with a small telescope. So and then Charles Crow, also a couple hundred years ago, suggested that we use mirrors to reflect sunlight to the Martians, and the several mirrors to outline the shape of Ursa Major there. You can see one where he lived in Paris.
Yep.
So these were all the ideas at the time, and you laugh at these ideas now, but you know, that just means that 200 years from now, somebody will be just laughing at this AppJ paper we just published and say, Dan, you stupid idiots, why are you know? So I think, and if you kind of look at what we did in the last century, it was mostly radio, because we invented radio. You know, Tesla and Marconi, those pioneers did radio searches. In the 20s, the Navy observed Mars. They were developing radio. Frank Drake did a really nice search in 1960. He had good access to a good radio telescope. Then when we invented lasers, I think next slide, then we said, oh, we should, you know, ET might use lasers. So we started thinking about lasers, and now lasers can communicate across the galaxy. And so we think for point-to-point communication, maybe not kind of accidental discovery of an artifact from a civilization, but if ETs are, if there's a big galactic internet out there, maybe they're doing a lot of point-to-point, that would be good for interstellar communication. So the technology is changing. So I'm a little bit worried that SETI is kind of anthropomorphic. It's like we're just the technology of Earthlings, that's what they're going to do. But, you know, we've only had radio just a blink of an eye in our history. So we used to think that the habitable zone was just a narrow region around a G-type star. Now we think, you know, a lot of planets around a lot of stars, and there are lots of habitable zones and lots of places for life. We used to think that you couldn't do binary stars. Now we know there's habitable orbits around, you know, if the stars are close together or far away. So there's a lot of things we used to think that turned out to be wrong. So my guess is that the stuff we think now we should do in SETI is probably wrong. This is another example. We used to think there'd be no life way outside the habitable zone, but as you know, Europa and Enceladus have liquid water on them. Maybe there's something swimming around down there.
I do believe we have a NASA mission heading out to Europa to.
Yeah, that's very exciting.
Yeah.
I'm excited also about Enceladus because it's easier to sample because of the fissures and the jets.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of naive to think that we know how to search, given our kind of history of our. I think the right strategy is kind of a multiple strategy, that you want to look at a lot of different things, a lot of different kinds of signals, a lot of different wavelengths. We were talking about earlier that half of the really interesting discoveries in astronomy are serendipitous discoveries. And so there's a good chance, I think, that SETI, if we ever find ET, it won't be somebody like me that's deliberately looking. It'll be some other astronomer or physicist looking through their data, and they find a little glitch that they didn't expect. I like these data mining experiments that look for anomalies, and I think we should be looking at all these new big surveys in astronomy and astrophysics, and looking for weird things. I like this survey that we're doing, but I also think we got to be on the lookout for things that we didn't anticipate.
Absolutely.
So the good news is that the capabilities are growing exponentially. These are radio telescope sensitivity. That's a log axis, so you can see, you know, things are going up fast. That's great for SETI. I would say Earthlings are really just beginning to learn how we might find ET, and we're just getting in the game. And if you look at the big search volume of all the different frequencies and signal types and places on the sky, and we're just learning how to do it. We'd be really lucky to find ET if they're out there right now. But I'm optimistic in the long run because of these plots of kind of exponential growth. This is the number of spectral channels. So, you know, we don't know what frequency ET is going to be broadcasting on it, if they're doing it at all. So you want to look at as many frequencies. I started with 100 channels. Frank Drake had one channel and the early radio pioneers, but then we did 65,000 channels, then 4 million. Then the new one has, I think, 20 billion channels, the one that we talk about in this paper. And that's, you know, the number of channels is doubling every 20 months. So that's not because I'm getting smarter. That's just, we're just taking advantage of the Silicon Valley technology, mostly driven by the gaming industry. We're using these GPUs that are made for drawing bloody guts and pictures
This
on.
was in the paper, but this is still centered around the water hole, yeah?
Well, we're trying to branch out from that. This particular paper is mostly around the water hole. It covers a gigahertz to 1.5 gigahertz, but we're trying to cover more and more octaves. I think each octave is interesting, and infrared, radio, visible, ultraviolet. I think all these different things are interesting. This is power, computing power going up. Right now, computers are as smart as a guppy or a lizard. You know, at the singularity, when they get as smart as humans, we'll be doing some really interesting SETI. Might not be so good for our species, but might be good for SETI. Anyway, I'm optimistic in the long run. If I think we'd be very lucky to find them in the near run. But if this exponential growth continues, we can cover a much more thorough parameter space, and maybe Earthlings will find extraterrestrial civilizations in our lifetimes.
Hey, is your computer on here from when you were in the club?
Let's see, 1970, yeah.
Okay.
We should put a dot on that. For
Yeah, absolutely. You should put yours on there, right? I see an Apple II. I see some CDC.
Yeah, I don't see Dan Wertheimer's computer.
TDP 10s.
Good idea.
Awesome.
Anyway, if this exponential growth continues, we'll be able to do a lot more of the band. We'll be able to cover a big chunk of the sky, you know, simultaneously. So I'm excited about these new technologies that are coming up. We're not doing the same experiment that I did 40 years ago. So let me just say, if we have a little more time, about what we're planning and what other people are planning.
Let's go for it.
So let's see, what's the next thing might be some radio experiments. So this is not a SETI experiment. This is a EOR experiment that we're building in South Africa. It's a big collaboration that Berkeley is leading, called HERA, Hydrogen Epoch Reionization Array. And it's about the size of the FAST telescope, but it's made out of lots of little dishes. This is an artist's conception, but we do have 100 of these telescopes built, and we're hoping to do a SETI and FRB experiments. It's not just, although it's built for the EOR to look at how the first stars and galaxies formed at redshift of 10 or so. But that'll be interesting. That's because very little SETI has been done at low frequencies. And this is an artist's conception of the SKA, or the mid-frequency SKA. It'll be composed of thousands of dishes, maybe, if we get this thing built. And we're starting a SETI experiment on the prototype for that, the Meerkat telescope, which is a beautiful telescope array of 64 dishes in South Africa. South Africa, by the way, has a big desert. Australia does too, which is a good place to put these telescopes. Australia is also building the SKA low frequency. And you want to get away from people, and it's really dry and hot, and nobody lives here. So that's a good place, not too much RFI.
I gave you an interesting UV plane coverage there with that.
Yeah.
That arrangement.
Oh, I want to say a few words about this new project that we're starting. This is one that I'm quite excited about. So one of the things we're worried about is that these signals may not be on all the time. You know, what if they're little transient things like FRBs? What if they're just on for a millisecond every month or something like that? So what we'd like to do in SETI, we're just starting to figure out how to do this, is do a thing that can look at a big area, a big solid angle on the sky, and just kind of all sky all the time to search for these rare events. So if maybe they have a pulsed laser that's just on for a nanosecond every once in a while.
Okay.
And you know, the kind of SETI that we've typically been doing is like we just look at a millionth of the sky at a time. So it'd be very difficult for us to find these kind of pulsed events. So what we want to do is this SETI thing is each dome has got 100 telescopes poking out in different directions, and each telescope covers 100 square degrees, 10 by 10 degree field. And this is an artist's conception, obviously. We don't have 100 telescopes now, but I think the next thing is what we do have, which is 2 telescopes. We just built a prototype of the first 2 telescopes. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that. This is at Lick Observatory. So these are our 2 prototype telescopes. We think we need 2 pointed at the same place. You notice these are not pointed at 2 different fields. And the reason we need to do that is because you do get these false alarms from Cherenkov radiation that makes you think you might find ET. In the final system, we'll actually have 2 domes separated by about 1 kilometer. And then we can figure out if it's some atmospheric phenomena because of the parallax. And we'll be able to reject things that are in our own atmosphere with 2 different domes.
Where is the Cherenkov radiation coming from?
So this is a cosmic ray entering the atmosphere and causing a shower of particles. Okay. If you just have a single telescope, usually you can reject it because it covers a pretty big chunk of the sky. And ET you'd think would just be at on one of your pixels, a point source. But sometimes if it comes straight down at you, you just see it as a single kind of consistent with your point spread function. And so, but if you have 2 telescopes 1 kilometer apart, then you can measure the angle on the sky and reject things that are in our atmosphere.
Okay.
This is this prototype telescope. That's one of those things one of the ones at Lick. And then let's see, the next slide is what's happening at the bottom. These are really cool detectors. So we've been doing optical SETI looking for laser signals with photomultiplier tubes looking for these nanosecond flashes. But that's like $1,000 a pixel. But there's this new technology that's came out that's much cheaper. It's used in PET scanning machines. That's why it's cheap. Positron emission. When you're looking for cancer, you surround a patient with these silicon photomultipliers, and so instead of $1,000 a pixel, now it's like $10 a pixel. So that means we can cover the sky with 100,000 pixels. We can afford to do this, have this large sky coverage. It wouldn't have been possible a few years ago.
Nice.
The other technology are these Fresnel lenses that we're using, these plastic lenses. Anyway, we haven't found ET, but I'm not sure. I'm a little uncomfortable saying, well, give us money because of spin-offs, but we haven't found ET, so I brag about the spin-off. So one of the things that we talked about before is volunteer computing, that we did this SETI Home project a lot of people know about, where you break the data into little pieces, different parts of the sky, and we have millions of volunteers around the world, one of the biggest supercomputers to analyze the data. And that allowed us to do a much more sensitive search and look for a much richer variety of signals. And then we talked a little bit about the different projects that you can do using this general purpose. And you can now, if you go through the next few slides, you can allocate your computer. This is SETI at Home, but you can also choose from 100 different projects. And we mentioned COVID-19. These are the 8 million people running SETI at Home, and they do, a lot of computing, 1,000 years a day if we just had a single computer. And then these other projects, you can look, that's educational spin-offs from this project. But now you can look for COVID-19 drugs, cancer drugs, malaria drugs. If you go through the next slide, you can see, that's this infrastructure for volunteer computing, BOINC, that I think you said you know a lot about it. And let's see, next slide is, all these different projects. Next slide is that's the SETI Home. Next slide is climate prediction, global warming. You can use your computer. Next slide is Einstein at Home, gravitational waves, pulsar, astropulse, looking for primordial evaporating black holes. This is protein folding, similar to what we're doing with the COVID-19. By the way, these are not our projects. They use our infrastructure, our open source software, the BOINC software, but these come from different universities, different research groups. This is more citizen science, Stardust at Home, where people are looking for particles from the Stardust mission. You take a little training course, and then you run a virtual microscope, and you can find particles from a comet or interplanetary dust particles, figure out how the planets are formed. So anyway, so that's one of the big spin-offs. Next slide shows you all these different citizen science projects. There's hundreds of them now.
Galaxies, there we go.
So let's see, let's go through, let's see what else. I think the next thing is about future SETI. Oh yeah, so one of the big spin-offs from SETI is that people started using our instruments to do other things, and we developed this big collaboration called CASPER, Collaboration for Astronomy, Signal Processing, Electronics Research, where we took these SETI instruments and worked with a lot of people around the world to do all kinds of things. And one of the things that came out of that was the instrumentation to do the EHT that made the first images of black hole that was announced, I think that was last year. A lot of people are using these instruments to do pulsar research. I think the next slide might talk about that. Or, FRBs. Most of the fast radio bursts have been discovered on this CASPER open source instrumentation. And most pulsars, I think next slide might show some of that. The most massive pulsars, thousands of pulsars have been found with this stuff. I think those are interesting because you can look for gravitational waves, the millisecond pulsars, a lot of interesting things you can do with pulsars. Matthew Bales and his colleagues found a planet made out of solid diamond using these instruments. A lot of interesting discoveries. It's used a little bit outside of astronomy. We did a project to try to get data out of a person's brain to control a prosthetic arm. The next couple of slides maybe show that. So this is just a lot of signal processing stuff. So in the long run, we don't know how to do this now. So back up one slide. So I mentioned this briefly that, this is something we might be able to do in 100 or 1,000 years, is use our sun as a gravitational lens. And then you get 10-meter resolution on an extrasolar planet. So maybe they have technology like that. We don't know what these are a couple of quotes from Phil Morrison and Carl Sagan. Phil said, SETI is the archaeology of the future. So we can learn what's, if we ever get in contact with ET, SETI is really looking for technology, and it's very unlikely we're going to find them that they just discovered radio or lasers the way we have. It's more likely they're going to be 1 billion or 2 billion years ahead of us, so we could learn a lot. Carl Sagan said it's profound either way. I think what he meant by that is if we get on the galactic internet, we could learn a lot. If we find ET, that's interesting. But also, it calibrates our place in the universe is another thing that Carl said. But then it's also profound the other way. If we do a big search, a very thorough search, and we don't find life out there, intelligent life, that means life is incredibly precious, and we better take good care of our life on Earth.
Indeed.
So summary is we haven't found ET. We're still working on it. Might be a while. Don't hold your breath.
So if I ask you to look in your crystal ball here, when will Earthlings find ET?
So I have no idea. The Bayesian people say you should sign kind of equal probability to each logarithmic interval in time. Okay. So maybe 10% this year, 10% the next 10 years, 10% the next 1,000 years, 10% the next 10,000 years, 10% a million years. I don't really know. Maybe it's equal probability in log normal instead of log time. I really don't know. But it could be in our lifetimes. And we better start thinking about the consequences and how we're going to deal with it.
Indeed. Awesome. I'm going to stop this one. Dan, that was awesome. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, I'm sorry we went way over, but you can chop it off anywhere you want.
We're gonna let it roll. I think it's great. Yeah, SETI's fun. SETI's great.
Thanks, Frank. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan. And again, everyone, I'll put some links down below to SETI at Home, to BOINC, to the stuff I did with Chris Impey the other day. And check it out, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.